I love that. How you all doing tonight? I'm Hub Brown. I'm Associate Dean, and I welcome you here discussion this evening. Our guest, Nikole Hannah-Jones, is here. This is going to be a very interesting discussion about race and education and a number of other issues that we can really get into here today. I'm very, very happy to see you all here. We have these conversations at regular intervals in the Newhouse School, and you're invited to be a part of each and every one of them. We do these discussions to make sure that we get a chance to talk about vital issues that have concerns across our media, across issues that the media cover, and certainly in issues dealing with race, dealing with gender, dealing with ethnicity, dealing with a number of different issues. And so please enjoy this evening and keep a watch, because we continue to do these all year long. And again, it gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce Nikole and also welcome you on behalf of our Dean, Lorraine Branham, who cannot be here this evening. First of all, though, our guest. Nikole Hannah-Jones is a staff writer at the New York Times Magazine. She's been writing about racial inequality in schools and housing and other areas, and how that inequality is maintained through the official policies of the federal government, of states, of communities. She's won numerous awards, including the George Foster Peabody Award and the George Polk Award, for her reporting on the school district where Michael Brown, who was killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri, graduated. Just last month, she was named one of 24 MacArthur Foundation Fellows, receiving what is called the Genius Grant in recognition of the brilliance of her work. Ms. Hannah-Jones is also a founder of the Ida B. Wells Society, which seeks to increase the number of reporters and editors of color in the area of investigative reporting. Ladies and gentlemen, please give it up for Nikole Hannah-Jones.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming out tonight to hear what will not be a very inspirational talk. And thank you for having me in Syracuse. I've never been here before. Today's my first time, and I have really enjoyed the hospitality in the city. And I'm going to repay you by talking about some very ugly truths tonight. I am an investigative reporter at the New York Times. I like to say my beat is the segregation beat, because for the last 5 years, I've pretty much only been writing about housing and school segregation. I wanted to be a journalist since I was in high school, and I was bused starting in the 2nd grade from my black segregated school to majority, nearly all white schools. And when I was a high school student in a school that was about 20% black, and most of the black kids were being bused in from the east side of town, I told my black studies teacher that I felt like our high school paper never wrote about kids like me, and that I was bothered by that. And he told me, if you didn't like what was in the paper, join the staff or shut up and don't complain about it. So I took his advice and I joined the staff, and I started a column called From the African Perspective. And one of my first columns was whether or not Jesus was black. Now, being the burgeoning investigative reporter that I was, I couldn't prove that he was black, but I was pretty sure that he wasn't white. So I felt like I was successful. But I understood, from the very first time I wrote for my high school paper, and I suddenly saw black kids that I went to school with reading a newspaper that they had largely ignored because it never covered kids like them, the power of being able to tell our own stories and to be able to see stories that many other journalists simply would not see because of their own experiences. And that's when I knew that I wanted to write about race and racism in this country. Good for reporting, bad for humanity. There's nothing that you can look at in this country that there isn't a jarring racial disparity. Name a thing, and not a single person in this room would be surprised that black people are at the bottom or near the bottom, often vying for the bottom with Native Americans, which, by the way, are the two groups of people who did not choose to be here. or I should say, did not choose to be a part of the United States. But the way that most reporting has gone is that reporters write about racial disparity as if it somehow magically appears from the sky. So you'll see a story about black people are suffering from this, or we have a lot of segregation here. But what I seldom saw was accountability reporting about how this happened, why this happened, and why it continues to be so. And what that means is when we don't explain how it happens, people fill in the blanks. And the way that you fill in the blanks in a country founded on racial caste is to simply say, black people live like that because that's how they choose. Black people live like that because they don't want better. And I remember as a young child, understanding very clearly from looking around that the way that black people were portrayed in the media didn't reflect all of the black people I knew in my community who worked very hard but still never seemed to be able to get ahead. And I decided that I wanted to figure out why and to tell those stories. The first lesson for tonight that I want us all to take with us is none of the racial disparity that we see is accidental. None of it. It was all created. Most of it is intentionally created, and most of it is intentionally maintained. The second thing is that the way that we tend to write about reporting, to write about race in this country as journalists, or to cover race in this country, is we've become obsessed about, can we prove what's in someone's heart? Can we prove that these disparities because someone is racist? And what I look at in all my work is I don't care what someone's intent was. Did the action harm, and did you know it could harm? One of the things I say is if we write, for instance, about an oil spill in the Gulf, and ExxonMobil is responsible, we don't care if the CEO likes ducks or not. That's completely irrelevant how the CEO feels about nature. What we care about is, did the CEO of Exxon do certain things that he shouldn't have done? Did he know that those things could cause harm, and was there harm? But somehow when it comes to race, we can see all of the evidence, but we need to know, are these schools segregated because people really hate black people and they want it that way? I don't care. That's irrelevant. And so I think the hallmark of my work is I don't actually try to figure out what people's intentions are. I think you can tell people's intentions by what they do. And the only thing that's important as a journalist is figuring out what they do. So my work tends to be, have three main things. It's meticulously reported. And why is that? Because I am writing about racial inequality. I'm writing about things that people prefer not to believe and people prefer not to see. And so the reporting has to be above reproach. People may not like what I write, they may not agree with what I write, but the question I always ask is, show me the lie. Can you dispute any of the reporting? What I also do is show all of my work. I think now that we are in an era of fake news, it is very important that journalists are very transparent about their sources, about where they get their information from, and that we can't expect that people believe what we say. The good thing about writing about race is I knew that a long time ago, because most stories I write, people want to say are fake news. The stories also have to be intensely narrative. We all know if you can't make a personal connection with someone, we will abide really devastating inequality as long as we don't ever have to see ourselves in the people that we're doing this to. And the other thing is all of my work is deeply historical. I was a history major, a history and African American studies major in college before I went to graduate school for journalism, because I always wanted to understand, how did we get here? How and why are things like they are? And if you want to know why things are like they are today, you have to understand the history that created this. The thing that we fail to realize about segregation, there was a tremendous amount of resources that created segregation. Federal government, state government, local government, and private citizens put in an amazing amount of effort to create segregation, and we've been willing to put about this much effort into undoing it. When you try to undo segregation, we call it social engineering. What we don't understand, because we don't study history in this country, is that inequality was socially engineered. It is not natural. It is not the way that things had to be. It's how we chose them to be. So I started covering education as my very first job. As a newspaper reporter, my very first job was to cover education in Durham, North Carolina, which was a predominantly black school system in the South that was very segregated and was experiencing a lot of turmoil because of No Child Left Behind. I came to understand then that there are few things more important if we want to bring about equality in this country than education. That if we believe in the original mission of education, which is that education can be the great equalizer, that this is a place where if we want to make racial progress, we have to start. And it also happens that 9 of 10 American children attend a public school. So if the government truly wanted to do something about inequality, this is the place where it has the most control. So Howard Mann, of course, is considered the father of American public schools. And he said that education, beyond all other devices of human origin, is a great equalizer of the conditions of men. But of course, if that were true, I wouldn't be standing before you talking to you right now. The truth is that Howard Mann, when he decides in Massachusetts to try to begin this common school movement, he's willing to trade black children in order to reach his larger goal. So black children are excluded from his common school movement because he understood that if he wanted white people to pay for common schools, they were not going to pay for black children to be educated. This is our inheritance, is that from the beginning, we had made a decision that black children were not as valuable and their education was not as valuable as white children. So the truth of public education in this country is closer to this. And we've always had 2 philosophies of education, one for democracy, which is largely for white children, and one for oppression, which is largely for black, Latino, and Native children. So we're gonna go back. If any of you follow me on Twitter, you know I say I write about race from 1619, so we're gonna go back at least that far. I haven't yet in my writing been able to go back to the 1600s, but I'm trying. I'm inching further and further back. And this is important because people always want to understand why. Why do we still struggle with racial inequality? Why is this so hard? And I say it is because it is in the DNA of our country. This is our inheritance. 1607 is the year the English landed Jamestown. 1619, we import the first Africans to be slaves. We haven't been here 12 years. We have already decided that an entire race of people will be on the bottom of caste with no citizenship rights and actually no legal rights in this country at all. They are not even considered human beings. They are property. 12 years. This is 140 years before we even become a country. The Declaration of Independence in 1776, to those of you who know your history, you'll know that Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner, who owned his own children, writes in the original Declaration of Independence that slavery is wrong. And he blames the King of England for introducing slavery into the colonies. And he says that no nation can be free if it is holding its fellow brothers in bondage. Y'all remember reading that in the Declaration of Independence? No, because in order to get it ratified, he had to take that part out. So the Declaration of Independence that we have come to know does not include that passage about slavery. And then, of course, Thomas Jefferson does not free his own slaves until he dies because he needed the money. So as we begin this country that is to be the beacon of democracy, we have decided that we are going to hold thousands and thousands of people in permanent bondage and their children in bondage and their children after them. 1865, the Civil War ends slavery, and then we enter into 100 years of legal apartheid, where black people are still not considered citizens and still do not have the basic rights in their country. And then it's in 1968 where the last of the great civil rights legislation is passed. Anyone know what that last civil rights law was? Y'all don't know, it's gonna be history class. No one? Yes. The last of the great civil rights law is the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The Fair Housing Act is only passed because Dr. King is assassinated. Because we refuse. Lyndon B. Johnson wants to pass the Fair Housing Act as early as 1964. His advisors tell him if you want to pass any other civil rights law, you can't deal with housing. Why is that? Because housing was considered the Northern Civil Rights Bill. Housing was how the North accomplished Jim Crow. In the South, they passed laws. In the North, they put black people in ghettos. So you didn't have to pass a law that you couldn't go to school with black people, that you couldn't go to the same parks as white people, that you couldn't eat in the same restaurants as white people if black people were all constrained in ghettos. And we can look around at any northern city and see that that's how segregation was accomplished in the North. And so the very northern senators who were fighting to pass the '64 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act fought against the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. and King has to die, and 100 cities go up in flames before they have the courage to actually pass this act. Then in 1976, the most amazing thing happened in this country. I was born. Clearly, you see where I got my affinity for big hair. It's pretty fly back then. So I was born in 1976, which if you do the math is 8 years after black people finally got full legal rights in the country of our birth. 8 years. Now I know I look extra youthful. I'm 41. I'm not that old. This is not ancient history. So 8 years before I was born, it would have been perfectly legal to deny me housing because of the color of my skin. A few years before that, it was perfectly okay to deny me the right to vote because of the color of my skin. And a few years before that, only 12 years before I was born, it was perfectly legal to say that I couldn't eat at a restaurant, go to a shopping center, or go to a park because of the color of my skin. So we really, as Americans, want to pretend that this history is so far in the past, and it is not. It is really not. So what happens to all of that anger where we have to have a movement, a violent movement, just to get basic civil rights in this country? Somehow, the way we want to tell this story is we finally pass these laws, and then everyone sings Kumbaya, and we go into an equitable future together. But where did all those people who oppose these rights in the first place go? What happened to them? How did they raise their children? It's not like we passed these laws and followed this up with reparations to repair the damage that was done. We passed the laws and then said everyone's equal, let's move forward. So I'm gonna go back in time once again. I'm gonna go back to slavery. And I'm gonna go back to slavery because I'm making the argument that the fight for quality education for black children goes all the way back to when it was illegal to teach enslaved people in this country to read. And that from the founding of education in this country, we decided at that point that black children would never receive an equal education in this country. And to this day, in 2017, black children have never received an equal education in this country. Why is education so important? Black people were willing to risk their lives. They did risk their lives. They were maimed, they were killed, and they were punished for trying to teach themselves and teach each other to read. Because education for black people was not about moving ahead financially, it was about freedom. It was about understanding. Slave masters understood that if you were educated, you would think, and you would question, and you would not accept your position in life. That this was about liberation, and so it was literally against the law, sometimes in some places on punishment of death, to teach black people to read. This was a history for most of our country. And then, of course, in 1954, we get what is definitely the most important Supreme Court ruling of the 20th century, and I would argue the most important Supreme Court ruling in the history of our country, which is Brown v. Board of Education, which outlaws segregation in schools, but also sets the stage for outlawing segregation in every aspect of life. You don't have the '64 Civil Rights Act. You don't get desegregation anywhere else until the Supreme Court rules that segregation in schools is unconstitutional. And the way that we are commonly taught this story, if we're taught this story in schools at all, is that the Supreme Court passes this rule, and then our nation repents, and we try really hard to integrate for a while, and then it doesn't work and we give up. And now we are back to separate but equal, but it's okay. So I like to remind us a little bit about what actually happened after the Supreme Court rules in Brown v. Board. The South experiences a full-on revolt. They say it's an illegitimate ruling from an illegitimate court, and they are not going to comply. This young lady right here is Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges becomes the first black child to integrate an elementary school in the South. She's in New Orleans. This lovely child who's just a year younger than my own, with her bobby socks and her little attaché case, has to be escorted by federal marshals past the white mob that is trying to tear her apart so that she cannot go to school with their children. This picture here is of a little brown baby doll that they put in the casket that they carried as Ruby Bridges was trying to enter the school to tell her and her parents what her fate would be if she dared step into school with these white children. Ruby Bridges is 62 years old. She's younger than my father. She's younger than my mother. This is what people are willing to do to keep one black child from entering a white school. Ruby Bridges ends up spending her first semester alone in a classroom with her teacher because every single white parent pulls their child out of that classroom, and the teacher still taught her. I look at my own child and wonder, would I have been that brave to do the same thing? Probably not. This is Boston, lest we think this is a Southern problem. This is Boston after a federal judge there orders the desegregation of schools, finding that Boston had unconstitutionally segregated black children. This is Little Rock, Arkansas, with the students, one of the students who desegregated Central High School. Only one of those students would actually make it through the end of the year because of all the harassment they experienced. This is New York City, the bastion of white progressivism, when they decided they were going to implement a tiny desegregation program that was only going to affect a handful of students. Oops. These, of course, are the National Guard, having to escort children who want to get an education. This is Little Rock again. This is Rochester, New York. I think it's important to remember this, because if we wonder why we haven't been able to integrate our schools, we need to understand how violent and desperate the opposition was. And that opposition didn't go away. It just changed its character. 1988. That's the year when school desegregation peaks in this country. Now, the actual timeline is for the first 10 years of Brown v. Board, almost no desegregation happens in the South at all. Civil Rights Act of 1964 gets passed. It gives the federal government the right to sue school systems. And so we start to see real desegregation happening in the South really from 1968 until the early 1970s. And within a very short time of real enforcement, the South goes from the most segregated part of the country to the most integrated, and to this day, the South remains the most integrated part of the country. That's because the North didn't believe that Brown v. Board applied to it at all. And so the North largely failed to desegregate. Once you started getting court orders in the North, the court orders were useless because all the white people simply left the cities that were under the court order. That's how you get a place like Syracuse. That's how you get Chicago, New York City, Detroit. As George Romney, who's Mitt Romney's father, he was the governor of Michigan, said, white suburbs have created a noose around black cities. The Supreme Court rules in 1974 in a case in Detroit that suburbs don't have to integrate with cities. You can't integrate if there's no white children left. And so the North learned very quickly that the way you avoid desegregation is to simply move out of areas that have black people in them and keep black people from moving into those areas. So by 1988, when real desegregation doesn't start going until 1964, by 1988, we're already deciding to go backwards. One generation, after hundreds of years of legal segregation, one generation of desegregation, and we start to move backwards. So as you see from this graph, that's the peak of desegregation. We go from almost complete segregation in this country, both North and South, to a peak of almost half of black kids going to majority white schools. And now we are at levels of segregation we haven't seen for black children since the 1970s. But this is a remarkable thing. So this chart is a chart of test scores. And it shows, if you notice, the place where it's narrow. This is mapping the achievement gap between white students and black students. White students are the red line, black students are the black line. And you see at 1988, which is the peak of desegregation, that's where the test score gap between black and white children is the most narrow. And as we start to resegregate, that gap widens, and we've never gotten back to as narrow as it was when we desegregated. But what's most remarkable to me on that map is in a period of 17 years, we were able to close that achievement gap in half simply by desegregating schools. Think if we had kept going, where that achievement gap would be. Think what we could do when we actually decided we were going to live up to the values that we espouse as this country. But the truth is, even though black children are only 13% of the population, there's never been a single point where even half of black kids have gone to majority white schools. Now, I'm not a mathematician, I'm a journalist, so my math is not very good, But what I can tell you is that doesn't happen by accident. It's actually impossible unless you're really trying. And whereas once most segregation was within a school district, between schools, most segregation now, again, look at Syracuse, is between school districts, between white school districts and a black urban school district, and now increasingly between black suburban districts and exurbs, white exurbs. So it's almost impossible for a school system in an urban community on its own to desegregate because there simply aren't enough white children left in those communities. Here in Syracuse, I hear Syracuse is not number one for a lot of things, but you are number one in the state for the most segregated school district boundary. So give yourself a round of applause, just playing. Okay. So Syracuse has one of the most segregated school district boundaries in the country and the most segregated school district boundary in the state. And I went online and I wanted to see what do people of your great metropolitan area have to say about this. And I think that the comments are very revealing. It is like this because people want it that way. And in one of these comments, someone said, if you try to integrate my schools, I will be moved across a county line in 2 weeks to another white place where you won't be able to force my kids to go to school with black kids. Of course, Syracuse metropolitan area is also one of the most segregated in terms of neighborhoods, which is also not accidental. If you remember what I said, segregation in the north was accomplished through housing and not Jim Crow. The beauty of northern segregation is it was much more savvy, shall we say, because this is much harder to do anything with through the courts. In the South, where they were very explicit, black kids cannot go to school with white kids, you could go to the court, you could challenge that law. This is a matter of the court saying people just live where they want to live. There's nothing that we can do about it. And so it has been very hard to change. And then you can read the comments there on the side and see once again why. So how many of you guys have actually read the ruling, Brown v. Board of Education? Don't lie. I might quiz you if your hand's up. Most people have not ever read the entire ruling, and I don't blame you. Until I started covering school segregation, I'd never read the ruling either. I had a general understanding of what I thought it meant. What I thought Brown v. Board of Education was about was resources. How many of you guys think that's what it was about? What do y'all think it was about then? I thought it was about the fact that black schools didn't get the same things as white schools, and the court found segregation unconstitutional because of that. But the interesting thing about the ruling in Brown v. Board of Education is it doesn't deal with resources at all. It doesn't talk about test scores. It doesn't talk about funding. It talks about citizenship. And what it says is that in a country built on racial caste, when you separate black children from white children, that is an inherently unequal system. That you are depriving those black children of their fundamental rights in a democracy. And that the only way that black children can get full citizenship in their country is not to be separated from the majority and the power in this country. So we don't deal with test scores. Brown doesn't care about test scores. It says that separate cannot be made equal. But this is where we are now. So 1953 on the left, 2016 on the right. We all could admit that what happened on the left is wrong, but we all are pretty much okay with what's happening on the right. We have once again embraced Plessy v. Ferguson, which says separate is okay as long as it's equal. Except what we also know is the truth was the truth back when the court ruled in Brown v. Board, and the truth when the court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson is separate has never been equal for one day in this country. And it continues to be unequal. Unless we think this is a Southern problem, the picture on the left is the Bronx. The picture on the right is Jim Crow. Oh, excuse me, it is Jim Crow. It's Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Doesn't matter, north or south. You see the same thing. So how did I start writing about integration? Find what was going to work, and nothing was working. And I would go in these schools and I would see how hard everybody in those schools were working to try to somehow get a school where every kid was Black and Latino and every kid was poor to get the same test scores as a school where almost every kid was white and every kid was affluent. And somehow they couldn't do it. And it wasn't because they weren't trying. And then I'd watch as those schools would be taken over by the state, the principals would be fired, the teachers would be fired, and they'd come up with this brand new model that was going to fix it, and it never did. And so understanding that Black children are not less intelligent than white children, I wanted to understand why couldn't they fix it and what actually worked. And there was only one thing that worked on scale, and that was integration. And why does integration work? Not because there's something miraculous that happens when white kids sit next to Black kids that makes Black kids smarter. But I will tell you the miraculous thing that happens when white kids sit next to Black kids. Black kids suddenly get what the white kids get. That is why integration matters, because we've never been willing to give the same resources to Black children as we have to white. And the only way that we can guarantee that masses of Black children get the same thing as white kids do is they have to be in that same classroom with those white kids. We don't value Black children the same as white children. And I say this as a reporter, and I can give you all the data you would ever want to see that shows that to be true. Because today, according to data collected by the U.S. Department of Education, you can judge the quality of a school by the color of the kids in that school. The more Black and brown kids in a school, the less likely they are to have a qualified and experienced teacher, the less likely they are to have access to college prep curriculum, the less rigorous the instruction is, they have lower funding, they have worse technology, they tend to be inferior buildings. Across the board, every community in the United States. I've put out a challenge. If anybody can show me a community where that's not true, please let me know. I'd love to go study it. But all the data, I've spent 15 years writing about it. I've never seen a single community where Black schools are not treated less than white. And even worse than that, segregation harms Black children. The gap, instead of closing the gap, these schools are actually making the gap worse. The longer a Black child stays in a segregated school, the further and further they fall behind. So by the time they've graduated, they've gone from 2 to 3 years behind to sometimes upwards of 6 or 7 years. Now, if a school can't actually close the gap or maintain the gap, what are we doing? Unless we believe that through the years Black children get less intelligent, which doesn't make sense, then we have to understand that these schools are actually hurting the children who are in them. But much more important than test scores, because as I told you, Brown v. Board is not concerned with test scores. What the Supreme Court understood is that in a society founded on racial caste, segregation diminishes your entire life chances. So longitudinal studies have shown that a segregated education leads to a segregated life. That Black children who get access to integrated schools are more likely to go to college and graduate. They're less likely to be poor as adults. They're less likely to go to jail. They're more likely to live in integrated neighborhoods themselves. They are healthier, they live longer, and much more importantly, they pass those benefits on to their own children. This is how we diminish caste in this country, and the research shows this to be true. And even within the same family where one child got access to desegregated schools and another child went to segregated schools, the child who got access to the integrated schools had a different life trajectory than the child in the same family. Why does that matter? Because it's not just about saying, well, this parent worked harder to get their kid in a desegregated school and that's why they did better. It's actually the effects of the segregated education. So when I decided 5 years ago that I was going to cover segregation almost exclusively, I set up a Google alert. I wanted to see how often were we writing about segregation. All of these education reporters who were covering No Child Left Behind, and Race to the Top, and the reform movement, and the charter school movement, and the Gates-funded movement, all of these reforms, nobody was writing about segregation. Nobody was writing about integration. And I decided I was going to spend a year on a project, and I would wake up in a cold sweat, because I'm like, I'm going to write about this thing. Nobody's going to care about it, and my editor's never going to let me write about anything like this again. When I pitched this story to The Atlantic and I told them what I wanted to do, the editors at The Atlantic were like, yeah, everybody knows this story. Everybody knows the history. So I was like, okay, tell me. Tell me what the history is. And then it got all quiet, like y'all are now, when I asked you to tell me about Brown. Because the fact is, we think we know this history and we really don't. And I decided I was going to write about school segregation because the research was telling me that everything else we were trying to do was simply not going to work, and we were just pretending that we were going to fix the problem if we weren't going to deal with the fundamental issue of inequality in schools. And then I began to question, if there is one reform that works and nobody is talking about it, why is that? All of these people who say they care about kids and they care about education are ignoring the only thing that has ever worked on scale. Now, does that mean that there are no all-black schools that do well? Of course not. Does that mean there are no poor schools that do well? Of course not. But they're exceptions. They're the reason we hold them up as exceptions. It's not scalable. People at KIPP will tell you what they do is not scalable. They can't do it for an entire district. There's not an entire high-poverty segregated district in the whole country that has been able to produce high results for its kids. And I would hear all of the reasons why we won't talk about integration, the one thing that works. Politically, it's not possible. People don't want it. It's hard. What about busing? Are you saying we're going to put kids on buses, even though American kids have always ridden buses? And in fact, for the vast history of this country, American kids rode buses to segregate. We forget that Linda Brown, the lead plaintiff in Brown v. Board of Education, sued her school district because she was forced to take a bus past her neighborhood white school to go to a black school. So we were fine with busing for segregation. We didn't want busing for integration. But the one thing that I never hear when people talk about why we can't integrate our schools is that it's not what's best for children. Because everybody knows it's what's best for children. So then again, we must ask ourselves, what are we doing if we're not willing to do the one thing that we know is best for children because it's uncomfortable or it's politically not feasible or we just don't want to try that hard? I mean, the real reason is we created segregation for a reason. Segregation benefits white children. It allows them to hoard an inordinate amount of resources in a publicly funded system. And so that is why we sustain it, not because it's the right thing for children. And then I came to really be critical of all of the education reporters I had known who were writing about education and not dealing with what the facts were. And I realized that, of course, all of us report through our own lenses. And people look at me and they think they know what my biases are. But white reporters are considered neutral, as if white reporters don't have a racial heritage, as if they don't have a racial experience, as if the schools that they went to didn't look very, very different from the schools that most black reporters have gone to. But also that many white journalists are also implicated in the things that we cover. Am I really going to write about school segregation if I have a child who might now have to be bused? Or this neighborhood that I bought a house in because it would get me into the white school, that suddenly that white school might be zoned somewhere else? Am I going to write about school segregation? Am I going to challenge that system when I have my own child to make educational decisions about? And the answer is, most journalists had decided that they simply were not. And 4 years ago, I stood in front of the Education Writers Association. I won an award for writing about school segregation. And I told those journalists, if you're not writing about segregation, you're not doing your job. And a remarkable thing happened. They started writing about it. And now my Google alert that I have set up on school segregation, I get pings multiple times a day from stories that are being written about segregation. We are talking about this issue. Now, we're not doing anything, which is a problem, but at least we are talking about it. Because fundamentally, I'm a journalist, but I'm making a moral argument. And my moral argument is that I am speaking to progressive people who say they believe in equality, they say they believe in integration, but act in ways that sustain inequality and segregation. I'm not dealing with conservatives who don't even pretend that this is a value. I'm trying to get people who say they value this to actually live the values that they espouse. And what is true is that you cannot say you want equal educational opportunities for all children and then do everything in your power to fight to advantage your own. Simply doesn't work that way. And the same people who have always had the advantage continue to fight to maintain that advantage. I understand that this is hard. When it comes to your children, this is the hardest thing. And probably one of the pieces that I'm most well known for is the piece I wrote last year on choosing a school for my own daughter in a segregated system. This is my daughter when she was in kindergarten. She's now a second grader. I had written about education all these years, and most of the time not as a mother. And I would look at reporters and advocates who were writing about these schools and writing about how terrible and unequal the system was, but then you'd ask them where their own children were, and their children were not in the same schools that they were writing about, and they were the exact same people that they were condemning in their reporting. And so before I ever had a child, I knew I was not going to be like that. But it's much easier said when you don't have a child, and when you don't live in New York City, which is one of the most segregated and unequal school systems in the entire country. So when I had my child, and I live in a Black low-income neighborhood, I knew that I was not going to be one of those parents who use my privilege to get her out of the schools with our neighbors and with children who I write about. If you read the story, you know my husband didn't know that this was my plan. And we had lots of heated arguments about it. I got to go to integrated schools because of a busing program. My husband was a military brat. He went to schools that served Army bases, and so he never attended a segregated school a day in his life. And of course, the assumption is, as Black parents, we would pass that on to our children. And I have to say, in general, I don't think the sacrifice for integration should be borne by Black parents. Black parents didn't create segregation. We don't maintain segregation. For most of us, the schools are the only thing that we can offer our children. But with that said, personally, I decided to make a different decision. And the truth is, I don't feel like my child is better than any other child. And I don't feel like if a school is not good enough for my daughter, a school should not be good enough for any of our children. So ultimately, we enrolled our daughter in a high poverty segregated school. I can tell you what I knew from the research. My daughter's doing fine. She's in second grade. She's reading above grade level. But what's much more important, she's a good person. She's learning that children who have less than her are not any worse than her or less intelligent than her. They just have less. These are the values that I want to impart to my child. And it's understanding that segregation is structural, but it is upheld every day by the individual choices we make. And every time a parent says the problem's too big, I agree with integration, but not my child, you are sustaining the system. One of the comments I got the most from some angry white parents was, how dare you sacrifice your child for your pie-in-the-sky beliefs about equity? And my question is the question that I asked them back and that I ask all of us in this room. Whose children should be sacrificed then? Whose children should we sacrifice for segregation and inequality and to maintain whatever little bit of privilege that we have? Should we sacrifice them? These little kids in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, are they the ones we sacrifice? Who are in a school where only 15% of children can pass their standardized tests? In a school where 98% of the children live in poverty? That draws from the poorest part of town? A school that gets the least experienced teachers? Are they the ones we sacrifice? Do we sacrifice Maria? If you guys heard my This American Life piece about Michael Brown's school district, this is Maria who's in that piece. Maria went to school in Normandy. It is the worst school system in the state of Missouri. Out of 512 school systems, it's 512th. It is also the most segregated and the poorest school system. 99% of the kids are Black, 95% of the kids are poor. Not school, school system. The education there was so bad that finally, after 15 years of being partially accredited, the state of Missouri decides to strip the school district of its accreditation altogether, which is an extremely rare thing in Missouri. What that did was triggered a very little known state law that allows kids in unaccredited school districts access to a nearby accredited school district, and that accredited district cannot say no. They have the right to go there. If you know how race works in this country, the only school districts near there that were accredited were white. So Maria and a bunch of other kids suddenly got access to the white schools, and that's when Missouri decided they got to do something about what's happening in Normandy. What they decided they had to do was change the law to force those kids back to their segregated district. That was the only way that Missouri would do anything about what was happening in Normandy, was when suddenly those kids got integration and a right to go to quality schools. Luckily, the state Supreme Court overturned what they were trying to do, and Mario was able to stay in the high quality district that she was able to get in. But most of the kids didn't leave their district because the district was 30 miles away. It was a long commute. It was sometimes hostile. If you heard the This American Life piece, the parents got together in a public meeting that sounded like the same mob that met Ruby Bridges. Mario was there at that meeting, and she heard everything that those parents said about kids like her. So do we sacrifice her? Do we sacrifice Delisha, who I wrote about in 2014 in my piece, Segregation Now? Delisha, who her grandfather was born or started kindergarten the year Brown v. Board of Education was passed. He never attended a single integrated school his entire life. His own daughter attended integrated schools because of a court order after Brown. That court order was lifted, and Delisha starts school and attends 13 years of schools without ever attending an integrated school herself. Her experience mirrored her grandfather. All of those years later, she attended the exact same segregated schools he did, 13 years without ever attending school with a child who was not black. Now, Delisha was the homecoming queen who dated the football star, your classic all-American girl, except we never look at a child like that and call her an all-American girl. She was on the mayor's youth council. She was an honors student. She was a Star Track athlete. And she just knew that college would be the first time she would ever get to attend an integrated school, and she was looking forward to that. She asked me one time, do white people have movie theaters in their homes? I thought she was joking, but she literally had no idea how white people lived because she had never even had a real conversation with anyone besides a teacher or two. But while most kids like her, who are stars in their schools, would have come home every day to mailboxes brimming with college letters, she got nothing but letters from Army recruiters and Marine recruiters because her high school was a failing black high school. While the white high school across town offered 23 AP courses, her high school had none. Her high school didn't have a physics class, didn't have a newspaper, didn't have a yearbook. And so she got a 16 on her ACT. She took it 3 times. She couldn't get higher than a 16. And she got 1 college acceptance, which was to a historically black college in Birmingham. She's doing fine. But her dream of finally being able to attend schools with kids who are different than her, she never got to see that. And it wasn't because of anything that she did. It's because of what we did. And she told me, when she sat in her ACT prep course with kids from the white high school, she didn't actually understand all that she hadn't received until she sat next to them and saw everything that they know that she didn't. So do we sacrifice her? Do we sacrifice the kids in Detroit, where there's just been a lawsuit filed for violating the right to literacy because you have 11th graders who can't read? Every time I go to Detroit, I go back to my hotel room and I cry, and I've seen a lot of bad shit. Sorry. You have kids with no textbooks. You have kids with no teacher. You have kids who have rats in their schools, schools with no windows, schools that have to close in the winter because it's so cold that they don't have heat, kids who have moldy food being served to them in the cafeteria in what was once a great American city. Most of you in this room wouldn't recognize the education being offered in these schools. So do we sacrifice them? We've already answered that question, because we are. Because there's kids in those schools right now. As one young lady told me, I used to want to be a nurse, but I can't read. So I guess I'll just go get a job. So the fundamental question I ask as a journalist is, what is objectivity in the face of injustice? I have never pretended to be an objective journalist. I don't think objectivity exists. I think all of us, every decision we make as journalists, who we interview, what beats we cover, where we're gonna place the story, how much time we give someone, all of these are subjective decisions. When it comes to injustice, I don't pretend to be objective at all. I think school segregation is wrong. I think what we're doing to children is wrong. And I think that my job is to expose the hypocrisy of all of us well-meaning liberal people who are willing to sustain this unequal system. One of the questions I get all the time, because I am not a hopeful person, I don't think my writing will change anything. I don't think that someone will read my writing and suddenly Syracuse or New York or Chicago is going to decide that they're going to integrate these schools. I don't believe that that's going to happen. So people ask me, how do you do your work every day if you don't have hope? And what I say is I am motivated by other things, namely rage. When you sit and look at high school students who know how little we value them and we value their education by the schools we build for them, and then we blame them and we say you just don't care about your education and your parents don't care about your education, that is what drives me, is a rage that we are willing, after all of these years, to still sustain a system where we don't value the education of Black children. And we need to confront this truth. And so it's not enough to feel good about ourselves because we think our values are in the right place. This is the beauty of how segregation works, is we don't have to see them, so we don't have to think about them. And if we don't have to think about them, we can be okay. And so in the oldest of journalistic traditions, my work is to shine that light and to say you may not do anything about this, but I'm damn sure not gonna let you ignore what it is that we're doing. So with that said, I'm gonna leave this very uplifting speech on what is possibly a high note. Because the thing that I remind myself every single day is that maybe things won't change. But as Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. So with that, I thank you for your attention. A mic, or people are just gonna talk? Okay, I think we're gonna do, how long are we doing Q&A?
Okay, stay right there. Okay, so we do have some time for some questions. There's a microphone up there, and this young lady has one microphone down here, so push up your hand if you have a question for Nikole. I see, there's one back there.
Hi, how's it going?
Great.
Excuse me. In 2006, Bomani Jones wrote an article about former NBA owner Donald Sterling and his whole initiative to try and force the suburbs of Los Angeles to be predominantly white. It was ignored, and then 8 years later, obviously, Sterling got caught on tape with his remarks and ended up losing control of the team. Why, in your opinion, did that first article go ignored? And do you ever feel that about some of the work that you've done?
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, Donald Sterling had a long track discriminating particularly against Black renters. He had a long history of this. There were articles about it. No one cared. He was still able to operate his team. And then when he gets caught making racist remarks about some very rich basketball players, then all of a sudden he loses his team. I think that's, it is a great example of the fundamental problem with the way that we deal with race in America. We are unwilling to deal with the hard structural issues. We want to be able to condemn things that seem very explicit. You say something bad about a Black person, we'll condemn that. If you actually do things that harm Black people generationally and large numbers of them, we don't want to acknowledge that. I always call it the racist of the week coverage, that is the way that we are comfortable dealing with race, is these very kind of sharp incidents that don't take a lot of digging, that aren't really hard, and that don't really force us to grapple with anything, because all of us can look around and be like, I'd never call a black person the N-word, so that's not me. But if I have to deal with, why am I living in an all-white community? Why is my child in an all-white school? Why do I work in a workplace that's progressive, but there's no black people here? That's looking in the mirror in a way that most of us are not willing to look at. So I think we are fundamentally willing to sustain racial inequality, and we can feel very good about stamping out that kind of virulent form of racism that none of us think we would take part in.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. That's an experience that happened to me, like literally your entire presentation. I was supposed to go to Nottingham High School, which is one of the schools in SCSD, and I got moved out to the suburbs and went to Janesville DeWitt, which is a predominantly white suburban high school. So literally, that was my life. You covered that in the entire presentation. This is just an opinion question, but it's not just simply about integration, but also the patterns and practice that go on at schools, right? So something I'm thinking of is like things that would happen as a regular thing in a city school would never happen in a suburban school. Primarily, the moment that kids, and I do this in my line of work, I have to go to schools all throughout Onondaga County. The moment that kids in SCSD have to go through the door, they have to pass a security checkpoint pretty much. They have to walk through a metal detector, put their bags down as if they are a terrorist, a criminal, somebody who is inevitably going to do harm because they are a black body in an educational space.
Yes.
So my concern, not just beyond integration, which I think obviously, but what would that look like in your imagination? All of the patterns and practice when you put all these people together?
It was going to be hard. And I don't somehow believe that integration will magically mean that black children will be treated right in all circumstances. What I always say is, if you are black in this country, there will be a struggle. It's which one, and which one is the least harm. So I went to, my elementary school, I think, had 5 black kids. Academically, it was great for me. Socially, it was traumatizing. It was very difficult, and I knew from that experience I would never put my own child in that circumstance. So when I talk about integration, I mean integration. I don't mean a handful of black kids going into white schools. I don't mean black kids going into schools where the entire curriculum is based on everything that white people did and nothing that any people of color have ever done. I don't mean going into schools where there's no educators of color. I mean truly integration, where there is a power sharing, where there is a cultural exchange, and where people feel represented and heard. Now, for me to be a very pragmatic person, I understand that that is probably not going to happen. So what that does mean is that we will, as black people, we will face a struggle. But what I can tell you is that the struggles of a child like me who got a good education, but socially it was difficult, are completely different than the black child who goes through a school that doesn't educate him. And if you have to pick one, this is the one that we're going to pick. But if we're going to fight for this, then we have to fight for it all the way, which is true integration and true equality, and not simply be satisfied with getting kids in the same building and then we track them to different courses, or we push them out, or we discipline the black kids more harshly. Like, it truly has to be equitable. What does that look like? We don't have a lot of examples.
Painting major here at Syracuse University, and I, like everyone else that stood up, just truly appreciate your work, the sacrifices that you made to be a teacher as you are learning at the same time, and I just truly appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. You can choose to answer either one, or not any if you don't want to. Your choice. But I was wondering, what are 3 books that you would take to your grave with you? And then the top 3 characteristics that you feel helped you get to where you are today, and how did you build and grow?
Is that 3? That's 3.
Right. Wait. Is that no? Oh, is it? You know what? I'm gonna just ask the last one. I'm more interested in the last one. Okay, 3 characteristics you feel helped you get to where you are today, and how did you build and grow these characteristics within your lifetime? So, were you always as disciplined? Were you always as, you know, et cetera, et cetera? How did you build those things? Thank you.
Okay, so the 3 book, all-time favorite book, period. The Race Beat, which is a book about civil rights reporters and how the press worked, you know, that without the press, the movement likely would not have been successful. And the 3rd book is the autobiography of Malcolm X. 3 characteristics. You like odd numbers? I think, 1, I'm stubborn. I'm stubborn, I'm very critical, and I'm questioning. So from a young age, I have always refused to believe something just because someone told me it was so. So I'm the one that broke it to my older sister that Santa Claus did not exist, okay? And so you know, again, like when I would see things that didn't make sense to me, like people saying black folks just don't want to work, and I'm watching my uncles and aunts come home from the slaughterhouse with blood all on their clothes and their knuckles swollen, unable to even pick up a fork at the end of the day because they had to feed their families, I just knew that this wasn't true. And so I always just had this questioning about why are things like this, always wanting to understand. And then a sheer stubbornness that through my whole life, people have underestimated me. People have told me I shouldn't dress like I dress or wear my hair like I wear. I shouldn't write about black people so much. And every time I just had a sense that I know who I am and I'm gonna do what I think I should do. And I won't say, I told some students earlier that it didn't make my path more difficult, because it did. But I had to, in the end, if I was gonna get here, and I wasn't guaranteed to get here, I was gonna have to get here being myself and with my integrity. And so I think that stubbornness, which my husband and mom would say annoys the fuck out of them probably all the time, I think also is why I'm standing here before you today. And if I can just, no one asked this question, but I just need to say this. I write about why integration is necessary for black children because it is a matter of justice. But I think it's important to understand white children benefit from this too. Nobody else in my school is a MacArthur genius. I was the black kid, the poor black kid that white parents felt they needed to protect their children from. I had just as much or more to offer them as they had to offer me. I don't think we believe that. We have a history in this country, which is why black children need access to white children to get the same resources. But black children, let me tell you, the kids in my daughter's school are brilliant. If they had the same resources as my child better watch out. And that's why we keep segregated schools, because we understand that we have a lot more competition if we educate all of these black and brown children in these schools. And we don't want that competition. So if there's a message that you all take, these kids are not less than your kids. And your kids will benefit just as much from being around these kids as our kids benefit from being around yours. And I know that wasn't your question, but I just felt like I needed to say that.
Hi.
Hey.
With injustice, objectivity doesn't exist. And I want to know, do you ever consider this a risk that you're taking, not being objective in your line of work or your credibility? Do you care if you do? And do you have any advice for those who feel passionate about injustice but maybe lack the courage that you clearly have? Thank you.
Good question. I think the only way you don't have an opinion about something is you don't know enough about it to have an opinion. Once you know enough about anything, you have an opinion about it. I think the difference is most journalists just don't tell you what they think about things, and they don't let it be known what they think about things. And as a practice, I think that's right. I would never advise young journalists to let their opinions be known about what they cover, because then you do allow people to detract from your work. People can say, I don't have to believe what you're writing because you're biased. For most of my career, no one knew what I thought about anything. I'm at a particular place. I clearly don't care what people know. When I did the piece about my daughter, that was a very hard decision, because I did worry that once I write a personal story about the thing that I cover, will I ever have credibility in some circles again? And maybe I don't. I ended up writing the story really because I'd been writing about school segregation. My daughter's school became embroiled in this integration battle, and all of these people were emailing me and calling me like, are you watching what's happening in that school? Are you gonna write about it? And I'm like, my daughter's in the school. And so it became a point where I almost had to write about it. But there's a trade-off for that. So for the journalism students in here, I think in general, you should keep your opinions to yourself. Your work should speak for you. Because I don't believe in objectivity doesn't mean that we shouldn't at least aspire for people not to know what it is that we think about what we're covering. But much more important than objectivity to me is accuracy and fairness. The thing that people can't say about my work is that it's not accurate and that I don't try to be fair to everyone. Anything that I write, I read it back to the person that I'm writing about. And if there's anything that you're uncomfortable reading back to that person, you might want to think about whether you should publish it or not. And that's the way that I ensure that I'm always fair, and I check back in with my sources. And even if they don't like what I write, I say, let's talk about it. Nothing will be a surprise. I hope no one will ever think that I treated them unfairly, even if they ultimately don't agree with what I write. But in general, and I think it's much, I didn't have social media when I was starting out as a journalist. I barely used email. I think it's much harder now because people are expected to be personalities on social media. I'm terrible at this. I cuss people out on Twitter like every day. But realize I'm in a different position than y'all. I couldn't have done this 5 years ago. If I did it 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't even be in the position that I'm in. I would have been penalized for it. So I think you have to be very careful, and mostly you should play the cards close to the vest.
International student from Germany, and going to school in the US when I was 15 as a sophomore. And I went to an international, like a boarding school in Vermont, which is really in the middle of nowhere. And because it was a really, really rural area, the school claimed itself to be independent. And what that meant was that it was a public school and a private school combined. So there was a lot of dorm students paying a lot of money to go there, a lot of international students. And then there were day students coming from all over pretty much the area, because a lot of the smaller towns didn't have high schools, that were able to go to our school without having to pay the tuition. And our school always prided itself upon being super diverse and super fair and introducing change, but I didn't really see a lot of diversity, which might...
It was Vermont.
It was Vermont, which might be to blame because there's not a lot of diversity in rural Vermont. But I was wondering, have you come across international or rather independent schools in your research and in your reporting career where you have found actually a difference compared to public schools? Areas of being a public and a private school, and if there has been actually a difference compared to other schools. Does that question make sense?
The problem with trying to compare independent schools is they're just a school, and you're usually comparing them to an entire district. If you look at any individual school, you can find every type of individual school, and you can find very well integrated individual schools. It's just systemically, most are not. I think the most interesting school to me is the Hershey School in Pennsylvania, which is, it's a boarding school, but it's a boarding school for poor kids, and it's amazing. Provides a stellar private school education, completely free to poor kids of every race. And so it's probably one of the most racially integrated independent schools, but every kid in there is poor, which I think is pretty cool. But overall, I think that you have some very well integrated independent schools, and you have independent schools that look just as segregated as other schools.
I think that you raise topics that are very important that we don't discuss enough, and I think that more people like you should have the power of reaching an audience that can talk about these topics. I'm from Brooklyn, and I went to...
I live in Brooklyn.
went to what I thought were diverse schools, but at the same time, my high school, which has, a lot of non-white people, at the same time, my senior trips were Japan and Greece and these extravagant trips that I personally couldn't afford for sure, but a lot of people couldn't afford just because, this was a really privileged school.
Was it public or private?
It was public.
What school was it?
On an individual level, how can I help this problem? What can I do to mitigate, at least on a small scale? What can I do personally to assist in dismantling this issue?
Damn. I always get that question. It's harder for you because if you were older, I'd be like, put your kid in your neighborhood school. You don't have kids yet. So in the future, if you have children, actually, live your values. But I think what each of us can do, particularly white folks, this is the problem that white people have to fix. Our schools are segregated for one reason only, and that's because most white people choose it to be that way. So you have to do the work of convincing other people like yourself to do something different. Advocate. So, for instance, I know in Syracuse, there's some people who would like to see you guys go to a county-wide system where you eliminate all of these individual inefficient school districts. And for many people, that is an automatic non-starter. We will not even discuss it. If you won't even discuss that, then you're not serious about actually doing something about the problem of segregation. So how does someone who doesn't have children in the schools help to foster that movement to bring more equity? Because while I'm hopeless in general, I have to remind myself, my dad was born on a sharecropping farm in Greenwood, Mississippi in 1946 when black people had no legal rights in that state. Here I am standing before you today, a reporter at the New York Times. My dad and my grandmother couldn't even have dreamed that this was possible for me. My grandmother cleaned houses for white people her entire life. So we know that change can happen. And I think sometimes, I spent a lot of time in Birmingham and studying the civil rights movement. And when Rosa Parks and Fannie Lou Hamer and all of these countless other people decided that they were going to challenge an entire system of Jim Crow, they could not have imagined that they would actually topple that system. That would have been an impossible thing to dream about. But they did that. So if we don't actually imagine that thing that seems impossible, we'll never actually fight to bring it about. And the only way that you'll begin to fix that problem in this city, in this community, is to stop the dividing lines between these affluent school districts and the city of Syracuse. So that's what you should work on. Start the movement, join with other people who are working on that issue. Stop trying, we have to stop trying to look for these little minor changes that really aren't gonna affect much and aren't gonna challenge anything and aren't gonna change anything. The odds against that, realtors love it, right? Because segregation allows them to sell houses in this community for a lot more money than they sell it over here. People want to be able to know that if I buy into this community, I get access to these schools. You're challenging an entire system. But what I'm saying is that's exactly what it's going to take. I always give long answers, sorry.
You left, but I don't blame you. But I also had a question more about your process as to how do you, with your biases, make and craft this fair and accurate story, and what is your process in developing your stories? And also thank you for everything you've been saying. It's complete and utter truth.
I read everything I can find on what it is that I'm reporting. I seek out texts and research that is opposite of the thing that I'm arguing. I think it's really important to evaluate your argument from all sides, even though in the end, I think the data on school segregation is really clear, so it makes it easier. There is no research that says it's good for black children. That doesn't exist. So I think to me, I've been writing about school segregation so long, I just know a lot about it. Every new study, like I said, I have Google alerts on it. I'm in constant touch with scholars who research in this area, and whenever they publish anything, I ask them to send it to me. I just read obsessively on it. I read the history of it. I read the contemporary literature on it. I read anything that anyone is writing about it. I don't think that's a normal process for people. I don't think it's possible for a lot of people. Most journalists can't spend a year on one thing. But that's my process. I do struggle in some ways because what is fairness to someone who wants segregation? What do I owe him or her? What do I owe? I just did this cover story, I think they were showing it when you first came in, about a white community that was trying to break off from a diverse, not majority black, but plurality black school district in Jefferson County. And what was so remarkable about it was just how explicit they were in their racial motivations, which is rare to see these days. And so the question is, what do you owe that? How much space do you give people like that? And I think one of the things that news has suffered from, which perhaps is what opened the door to charges of fake news, is this false equivalency reporting, where we feel like you give climate change deniers the same amount of time and space and prevalence as the bulk of scientists who say that climate change is real, in a sense, in a quest to be fair. That's not accurate, though, and I don't actually think it's fair because it's unfair to the bulk of the science. So I think that's something that, as journalists, we always have to wrestle with, is how much do you give a viewpoint that's actually just not right? My answer is very little.
I'm from San Diego, and I originally went to an elementary school with 10 white people, going to a middle school and high school with 60% white people. So I totally understand the problem. With gentrification happening in multiple cities across the nation, how is this affecting your research, and what are you seeing through gentrification?
People will move into these communities, but they will not send their children to the schools. That's what's happening in my neighborhood. The whole reason my daughter's school became embroiled in an integration battle was because the neighborhood around the school had gentrified, but those parents were not sending their children to my daughter's school. Instead, they were sending their children to a white school a mile away that had become overcrowded. And so New York City decided to rezone some of those children to my daughter's school, and then all hell broke loose. Gentrification overall is very difficult in the communities that are gentrifying, but it does present an opportunity, because as these communities are moving in, you could actually integrate the schools if you tried. The problem is no one's really trying, and so what ends up happening, this is happening in Brooklyn right now, it's happening in my neighborhood right now, is white parents are getting together in groups and trying to decide which school will they go into and take over. Or should they start a charter school? Those are the two arguments that are happening. And this particular parent group, if you already have kids in the public schools, you cannot join the group, which tells you they're not interested in having people who are already in the neighborhood in the group, and you have to pay to attend a meeting, so that tells you a lot. So what could be a great opportunity to integrate into neighborhoods where the schools couldn't be integrated because there were no white people or middle-class people in the neighborhood ends up just recreating the same inequality that we already see. And in most cities, Mayor Bill de Blasio, who is a completely liberal mayor who won election based on the Black and Latino vote, who runs for election on the tail of two cities, will not say the word integration, and he will not say the word segregation. He will not deal with this issue because it's a non-starter.
Hi, my name is Alexis Jones. I'm a graduate student in the M&O program. Thank you so much for coming tonight. And my question is, a lot of people tonight have used the word diversity, and I think it's become such a buzzword. Colleges want to be able to put it on their brochures, workplaces want to put it in their mission statement, and I guess my question is, what does real diversity look like? What is your definition of diversity? But beyond, racial, beyond, socioeconomic backgrounds, what is the definition of diversity in 2017?
Did you notice the one person in the room who never used the word diversity?
You.
That would be me. I don't use the word diversity because I think diversity is a word that white people like because it requires nothing and everyone can feel good about it. Integration is about justice, and I'm writing about injustice. So I use the word integration and segregation. In the piece I did about my daughter, I talk about, so if you are a New York City public school parent and you're white, and I imagine this is true in Syracuse, you don't want your kids in an all-white school, or you would not be in the public school system. But what you do want is a little sprinkling of this and a little sprinkling of that. Not too many black kids particularly. I mean, the data shows the tolerance for % black kids among white parents is actually quite low. They'll accept large number of Asian students, significant number of Latino students, very low black. They want the racial balance to be where their children are still in the majority, even if only a slight majority. So that's what diversity means. And most New York City public school parents who are white, their children are in diverse schools, which means the schools are very racially mixed. But they don't look like the rest of the schools in New York City. New York City is a 70% black and Latino school system, but the typical white student is in a majority white school in the city. So I find diversity to be a fairly useless term. It is a kumbaya term that makes people feel good and actually leads to no justice whatsoever, and it doesn't lead to equity, and I don't use it. So what would it look like? It would look like integration.
So you've set me up well. And I'm kind of going along with this. I have been working in the communities and I'm trying to figure out
Who are you?
Oh, I'm just a professor here.
What do you teach?
I teach English,
Okay.
19th century British literature. So so I listen to a lot
That's
of
why you didn't say what you did, huh?
I listen to a lot of podcasts, so I've listened to your podcast. So I guess I have two questions. The one is embedded in, so how do we create the political will among white people, including white progressives? Because I have been pushing, and I say, here, if you really want even a diverse progressive political organization, you have to come over here. You can't just ask a few people, pepper people, to come over here. And I'm not having much luck, right? So, and I'm fairly new to this, and so I'm.
So you're asking me how to get your people.
No, I know. I'm asking that you are not a politician. You're a journalist, right?
That's right.
But you are talking about justice, and I guess I'm asking about mobilizing people for visions of justice. And and you also talked in one of your podcasts. It was a interview that I think it was from January that was rebroadcast when you got the MacArthur recently, that you were talking about how parents are consistently choosing the interests of their own children over the interest of the social. Is that correct? The social, the democratic republic, the public democratic, the well-being of the nation state.
Yes.
Correct? Was
Yes.
that okay? So that seems like it's part of the conversation in terms of how to create up a ideal of the nation or things like that. I also am not a politician, so I don't really know how to do this, but obviously you're in a lot of conversations with people. I knew you were in conversations with people downtown today, so I'm interested in what strategies you have found to be particularly effective rhetorical strategies.
That's easy.
There you go.
None.
Because, as you say, the will is not there and it's hard work.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I am not equipped to answer the question. I think like white folks have to get together and do some soul searching, because all I can say is what I've already said is we have the system we have because this is what most white people want. And if I knew how to change that, all of my work would be geared towards that thing, but I don't know what that is. I think, again, we have systems of segregation because it is a benefit, And who wants to lose that benefit? And then when it comes to your child, it's even more visceral, right? It's like, am I being a bad parent by not trying to get every advantage I can for my child? And I think that's a very hard thing. I was talking to this, arguing with this guy on Twitter, this white progressive who said, I'm fighting, he said it's not practical to ask people to give up their privilege when it comes to their child. And so, I believe in equality, but I had to use my white privilege to get my child in the best school that I could get. And, one parent can't change anything, so I did that, but I'm working on the structural inequality issues at the same time. And I'm like, okay, if that's what makes you sleep at night, fine, but understand the hypocrisy of that, right? That every individual decision is upholding the system. And if every white parent made an individual choice, we would not have the system that we have. And so we cannot condone our own individual decisions and then say, but I'm working on the structural thing over there, because that's abstract. How do you one thing I will say, I don't think we've done a good enough job of amplifying the voices of white people who went through desegregated schools as children and didn't fucking die, right? They somehow didn't get stabbed. They learned to read. They're okay. But we don't talk about that nearly enough. And truly, I don't talk about it because I'm like literally fighting for basic education for black children. And it doesn't seem like I should be spending my time, telling, the stories of white people who are okay. But I think that's a disservice, right? Because what I truly believe, and when I wrote the story about my daughter, the most unexpectedly gratifying thing was all of the white parents who wrote me and said, we made that decision 15 years ago, we made the same decision 20 years ago, and our kid turned out great. So I know you're worried, but it's gonna be okay. And I just kept thinking, if we could hear more of those voices, that maybe that would make a difference. But we don't hear those stories, and most white people, there's a great deal of fear. I mean, when I wrote about my daughter's school, I got emails from people saying, how dare you put your daughter in an unsafe school? My daughter's school is safe. I don't even know where they got that from, except the automatic assumption is a school with a bunch of poor black kids must be unsafe. That's the fear that you're dealing with, and so I think we need to amplify those voices, but the short answer is the one that I already said. I mean, y'all have to decide to fix it or not. Yeah, she's been raising her hand for like 20 minutes.
Oh, okay, very good.
But
very good.
I'll be quick.
That's cool.
Let her go
now.
first, then.
I know you. You can hold up. We got you. We got you.
Really
ahead.
quick. Okay, so I'm not sure if you're aware with the selective enrollment system within high school enrollment. So like I grew up in Chicago, so like throughout my elementary school, I only went with like Black and Latino students. So like by the end of 8th grade, they make you take this test, and if you get a good enough score, you're allowed to go into like a selective enrollment school,
Yes.
which most of them are in the north side of Chicago, predominantly white. Because of that, I finally got to go to school with like a white person. Now, they do it based not only on your test score, but also like your neighborhood. So like your socioeconomic neighborhood, like what's the level? So I was thinking, like, do you think that's like a step forward to kind of solving the problem, or is it more like just using like kids as a token to get these white schools to have some people of color, but
Yeah.
only the brightest people of color?
One, I don't think that you change this system by offering escape hatches to a few kids who test well. In New York City, to get access to the specialized high schools, it's based on one test. And the test covers information that is not taught in the middle schools. I think that's fundamentally unfair. I think if you're an average student, you still deserve the best education that a public school has to offer. I don't think you should have to be brilliant. I don't think you should have to test well. I think every kid, this is the thing, we're in a capitalist country. If you can pay for private school, I can't argue for you buying whatever the best education you think you can get for your kid. But in a public system, every school should be equal. You should not be able to get a private school experience in a public system. You should not have privileged kids who are able to get a prime education in a publicly funded system, and then everybody else gets crap. So I fundamentally don't believe in talented and gifted. I don't believe in specialized high schools. I don't believe in screen schools. I don't believe in schools that you should have to test into. If I'm a C student, I still deserve to be taught I still deserve to be taught well, and I still deserve a good education. And that's what I believe.
Thank you. Hi.
Hey.
Stacey Fernandez, social justice reporter. I have two questions. So you talked about how when you go to the schools in Detroit, you go to your hotel room and you usually cry. So how do you deal with your mental health as a reporter dealing with these issues? And then two, obviously I'm a woman of color. In these newsrooms where, for the most part, they're white and we don't have much representation of people of color, especially at the top, how do you get your editor and your higher ups to give you the time and resources for these stories and to actually care about them? They're not going to care as much as we do, but still, how do you get them to care? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. I drink lots of bourbon. And I watch ratchet television. Which is not advice, it's just honest. I mean, in truth, it's doing this work day in and day out is very difficult, and particularly when you're looking at, the circumstances that we allow children to be in, and it's really hard, and I'm not great about it. When I get home from work, my husband knows I don't want to talk about work. I don't want to talk about the things that I'm thinking about, and I have a very hard time shutting it off. Love and hip hop is very helpful. Don't have to think a lot, especially if you've had a bourbon. I'm not saying that that's the thing that anyone should do. I think that in general, reporters aren't very good at dealing with the emotion of having to cover what we cover because we're taught that we shouldn't feel things about what we cover. I clearly do, but it's not easy. My husband says I should see a counselor. I just haven't done that yet. He would tell you I need it for sure. The second part of your question is, there have been times, so 6 years ago, I almost left journalism altogether because I was in a newsroom that didn't want me to write about the things that I got into journalism to write about. I had editors, Everybody knows that by now, yes. So, I was literally called into conferences and told you are writing about black people too much, you're pitching too many stories about this, and you need to stop. The only reason I didn't leave journalism is I literally couldn't think of anything else I wanted to do with my life. I just couldn't. I couldn't imagine what else I would do. This is the most amazing profession in the world, and as hard as it may feel some days, it's nothing compared to the lives of the people that I write about. And I feel like if I'm not doing that, I'm not serving my purpose in life. So that's what keeps me going. The advice that I can give you is the stories that you got into this to tell. And it may hurt your career at times. It may take you longer to get where you want to be. But if those are the stories that you have to tell, you have to fight and find a way to tell them. I stuck it out, and I luckily landed at a place now where I can write whatever I want. But I know a lot of other journalists who left the profession because they weren't able to make it there, and I can't say I can't say you'll get the breakthrough, but like I said earlier, at least you'll have your integrity.
I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yes.
And
y'all have been very gracious. Thank you.
Yes. And thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. And remember, as we say, journalism matters.